one person who would love to have been here today would be Bishop Paul Hinder, who is Ivor's bishop in the Vicariate of Southern Arabia. And Ivor, I think, made a very special effort to stay alive when he heard that Bishop Paul was coming to see him, making a special journey from Abu Dhabi. And he arrived early last Sunday morning, and he had an hour or so with Ivor in the hospice in Harris Cross. And then on Monday morning, we received just a message from the hospice, or Jimmy received a message from that Ivor was fading. And Father Sean and the bishop went immediately down. And so they took it in turns to go in, and Bishop Paul went in, and Ivor smiled in a recognition, and a few minutes later he died. So in many ways, Bishop Paul was very privileged. He just sent me an email yesterday, said he was very privileged to be there at that moment. And it sort of, if you like, he had an urgent mass today, which has been negotiated with the Muslim authorities so he felt he couldn't cancel, and that was where he was caught. So he just sent his best regards and to all the family of Ivor. Ivor's life was not that of preaching, but of a gentle witness to the love, compassion and mercy of God, without fanfare, often secretly. He worked in a world, after he left the Jesuits, he got a qualification in the airline industry, I think it's flight dispatcher, and he worked for many, many years, notably with Flying Tiger Airlines. And if you can remember Flying Tiger Airlines, that's going back a long way. At 53 or 54, he decided to try his vocation once again. And he spent 4 very happy years at the Beda College in Rome, which was founded in the 1850s because John Henry Newman, they'd nowhere to put John Henry Newman when they were training him to be a priest, a Roman Catholic priest, I should say. Ivor was ordained at the age of 58, and most bishops would have been content if they'd got 5-10 years out of him. This Vicariate of Saudi Arabia got 30 years out of him. And he was very active. He was ordained priest, and then he embarked on an entirely new career. What was extraordinary about this career when I was reflecting on it was that it was lived without the trappings of clerical life. It was lived, he was a teacher by day and a pastor by night. In both jobs, he excelled. It may have been very demanding and very lonely, and it required a great deal of generosity, and it required basically, and Ivor would have recognized that, it was the grace of God working in him. And finally, when the time came for him to retire as the headmaster of the school, the headmaster was very apologetic, but had pointed out that the retirement age for teachers was 65, but now that Mr. Egan had reached 83 years of age, maybe it was time, to take a step back. He came home, looked after his sister Grace, and on her death, I think he returned to Abu Dhabi, where he resumed his ministry, albeit in a more open society. He quickly gained a reputation as a pastor and confessor. However, by now he was reaching the time for the definitive return to Ireland. He returned to Rathfarnham, but felt very lonely living in the family home, and through the influence of another white father working in it was agreed that he would come to stay with the missionaries of Africa, initially for a trial period. Now, Ivor was a gentleman, and when I first met him, if you like, for the first time really, about 4 months ago when I came back to Ireland, the first thing that struck you was he was a gentleman. There's no other way to, and I mean that in the best possible sense. It was almost as if Rathfarnham of the 1950s or the 1940s came back. You half expected the 16 tram to be coming up behind him somehow or other. But he was a gentleman in that sense. He was used to living alone and living with, and it was also sort of problematic as how he was going to fit in to a missionary congregation that was used to community life. The White Fathers are not known for their dress code, but Ivor was always impeccably turned out in a collar and tie and a shirt, obviously, and a suit. And none of us knew that he had been made a Monsignor until a few weeks ago. And the last thing that entered our minds was that he would be buried in Monsignor's robes. So we buried him in his suit, his grey suit, white shirt, and I think it's the Belvedere Union tie. It's going to cause a bit of a problem in 100 years' time if they dig him up, because the Monsignor will be on the coffin and this will be gentlemen dressed very well underneath. He was a Monsignor because the local people petitioned Bishop Paul Hinder that he be recognised for his work in the Vicariate. They thought very highly of him, and when Bishop Paul announced, and when Bishop Paul told him that he'd been made a Monsignor, Ivor was absolutely appalled. Well, he didn't receive it very well. So in that sense then, that we're looking at an extraordinary gentleman who lived an extraordinary life. And it was a life lived very quietly, often out of the scare. But what impressed me about Ivor was that the number of people, even here, who are present here today, who knew him when he was working in the Gulf, and who have come and witnessed to him, so that despite the frail old gentleman that I knew, he was obviously a man with a certain amount of steel, backbone, that allowed him to live the type of life that he lived as a pastor and as a teacher. So we give thanks for his life. I haven't remotely covered many of the things that he did, but it's just to give you a glimpse that the frail old gentleman that we were looking at the last few days was in many ways much stronger, much more decisive, and much more independent in many ways. So we can stand now, and I will ask the members of the family to come and bring the prayers of the faithful.